Welcome, everybody. My name is Turkish. I'm an associate professor of political science here at Columbia. I also serve as the director of the Sakip Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies. And I'm delighted to welcome all of you here today for the final on-campus event of the Sabancı Center entitled Religion and Nationalism in Turkey, Events, Spectacles, and Emotions. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for being with us. We are delighted to welcome today Ateş Altınordu as our speaker. He is an associate professor of sociology at Sabancı University in Istanbul. He received his PhD in sociology from Yale University in 2010, and he has served as a visiting assistant professor of sociology at the University of Chicago. In his scholarship, he focuses on religion and politics, in particular the comparative sociology of politicized religion. So he has written extensively on the rise of political Catholicism in Germany in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and compared it with the movement for political Islam in Turkey beginning in the second half of the 20th century. He also writes about the role of popular culture in contemporary Turkish politics. Professor Altınordu's research has been published in numerous distinguished journals, including too numerous to list, and some of them I can't even pronounce because they're German, but including the Annual Review of Sociology, Politics and Society, Qualitative Sociology, Sociology of Religion, American Journal of Cultural Sociology, among others. He also serves as an associate editor of the American Journal of Cultural Sociology, is a member of the advisory board of the journal Cultural Sociology, and as a faculty fellow at the Center for Cultural Sociology, or CCS, at Yale University. It gives me special joy to welcome him today because we went to graduate school together. He was in the sociology program, I was in the political science program. So this is a special moment for me as well to be able to host him here at the Sabancı Center. Professor Altınordu will speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then we will take your questions and have a general discussion. So please join me in welcoming Professor Altınordu.
Great. Hi all, it's a pleasure to be here, and I would like to thank Professor Işıksel and Dr. Sümeyye Yar for not only this very generous introduction, but also for having facilitated my visit and for their great hospitality here at the Center for Turkish Studies at Columbia. So my talk today is titled Religion and Nationalism in Turkey, Events, Spectacles, Emotions. And this is a chapter that I wrote for the Oxford Handbook of Religion and Nationalism, which is hopefully forthcoming. And I would like to take this opportunity to pay homage to Matthias Koenig, one of the editors of the volume, a brilliant German sociologist of religion who passed away in the process of the production of the book. So this is a critical review piece or a thought piece. So I won't be presenting, my original empirical research, but I hope that I will be drawing some attention to some theoretical frameworks or findings beyond the Turkish case in the course of the talk. My chapter had 4 parts, but I will be drawing in today's talk from 3 of those in the interest of time. So I will first seek to clarify the relationship between secular and religious nationalisms in the Turkish case, because this is a very complex relationship. It would be a mistake to just consider them rivals, although they are rival currents and ideologies, but they also have some overlaps. So I would like to try to clarify those first. And then I'll move on to my focus on the role of events in the relationship between religion and nationalism, how they both express but also transform the constellation between those two, and how those events, once inscribed in collective memory, kind of facilitate the mobilization of politically consequential emotions through simple evocation. Then I will take a more cultural sociology perspective and I will focus on the role of political spectacles and fictional popular culture in bringing home the messages of secular and religious nationalisms. And finally, by way of a very brief conclusion, I will discuss a few ways which might allow Turkey to move beyond this impasse, right, or between secular and religious nationalism, because obviously this back and forth has not brought about democratization. Okay, so here's a list of a grim list of major instances. This is obviously not exhaustive, I wish it was, but major instances of discrimination and violence against non-Muslims in the late Ottoman period and early Republican and perhaps a little bit mid-Republican periods. And there's a continuity not only between the Ottoman Empire, late Ottoman Empire, and the Republic, which many historians have argued this very convincingly, and they see this as a rather continuous period in some respects, despite kind of the regime change, but also continuity between the experience of non-Muslims under secular and religious nationalists. So let's begin with the Hamidian massacres. These were the first major massacres of the Armenian population in Eastern Asia Minor, organized by Abdülhamid's government, and carried out by irregular armed groups known as the Hamidian regiments against the Armenian population, and ended up to their massacre in tens of thousands. This is under an Islamist sultan, right? Abdülhamid was known for his efforts to gather the population of the Ottoman Empire around a kind of Muslim identity, and also used this as a kind of foreign policy tool. Then we have the Armenian genocide, of course, which the other day, right, a couple of days ago, was the 111th anniversary of its commemoration, an unprecedented act of violence against the Ottoman Armenian citizens. This took place under the government of Committee of Union and Progress. They are secular nationalists, right, and they are very much in continuity with the Republican People's Party later. And of course, the genocide did not only result in the decimation of the empire's Armenian population, but also in a great amount of transfer of property and wealth, right, appropriation and transfer to Muslim populations. And after the declaration of the Republic, with the Kemalist regime, now we have the Republican People's Party in power, also secular nationalists, and in many ways a continuation of CUP. And we see that economic and cultural Turkification policies continued under them. The population exchange with Greece, it was a forced mandatory exchange, as many of you know, and this was part of the Lausanne Treaty, right, a protocol that is part of the Lausanne Treaty, and the new Republican government very much welcomed this, although most of the Greek population of Asia Minor had already, left for Greece. This provided a kind of post factum kind of legal sanction for this. Although this is generally referred to as ethnic unmixing, which I don't think is necessarily a misleading term, but the sole criterion, the criterion named in the protocol, right, for determining the populations to be deported was religious, right? The protocol said Turkish citizens of Greek Orthodox faith were to be deported to Greece. The capital tax of 1942 was kind of an instance of the targeting of minority wealth and property. This was kind of a levy imposed on wartime savings, yet it was exclusively implemented against the Greek, Armenian, and Jewish population. And there was a huge, I mean, not only was the population persecuted, but there was a huge, again, transfer of wealth from them. This is all part of the project that began with the CUP, as many of you might know, to kind of appropriate the wealth of the Christian and Jewish minorities and instead create a Muslim kind of bourgeoisie or commercial class. Cultural Turkification policies continued under the Republican People's Party government as well, changing name of non-Turkish names of provinces, towns, streets, the Turkification of Armenian, Greek, and Jewish last names, and significant restrictions on minority foundations in the Republic, including the banning of them from purchasing new property, and directly appointing their directors, right, by the government. And then comes the transition to competitive party politics, multi-party politics, right, in 1950. And in fact, ironically, religious minorities in Turkey, I mean non-Muslim citizens of Turkey, kind of had high hopes about this transition. And this is kind of surprising, I said ironically, because this is a shift to religious nationalist religious nationalist government, and we wouldn't associate, right, religious nationalism. I mean, think about, I don't know, BJP and Modi in India, where, we see so many policies against targeting the Muslim population. But in this case, non-Muslim minorities had suffered so much under secular nationalist rule that they actually had high hopes for this, about this transition, as Rifat Bali very articulately documents. And yet, that optimism was short-lived as well. The Istanbul pogrom of September 6, 7, 1955. So, this is under not only under the Democrat Party government, religious nationalists, but also instigated, right, by elements within the government. Tens of thousands of Muslim men raided the houses and businesses and shops and cemeteries and places of worship of Greek, Armenian, and Jewish citizens, which led to further immigrations afterwards, as you can imagine. So there's this continuity, right, in discrimination and violence against non-Muslims across secular and religious nationalist governments. And I think, therefore, we really need to get our hands on what is overlapping between those two currents and what is, on the other hand, different between them. And here I'm going to make use of UCLA's sociologist, important scholar of nationalism, Regis Brubaker, his distinction between religion as marker of collective identity. And this is a question of religious identity determining who's in and who's out of the nation, or at least as first-class members of the nation, and religion as substantive socio-political project on the other hand. And this means seeking to impose religious norms, right, in social life. And the first, I argue or underline, marks both secular and religious nationalisms in Turkey, while the second one is a point of contention between them. So the secular nationalists, the CUP, Republican People's Party, continued to rely on Muslimness as a diacritical marker of membership in the nation. And I think this is crucial. This latent role of religion in secular nationalism explains why discrimination and violence took place against non-Muslims under their rule. Rifat Bali writes, in the minds of the Republican elites, non-Muslims were strangers whose loyalty was suspect and not founding members of the Turkish nation. But this kind of, this fact was usually, became apparent in practice, right? And very apparent in practice, because it was often obscured by or hidden under a language of civic nationalism, which is also very much used by secular nationalists in Turkey. On the other hand, secular nationalists sought to first shape, but then also to diminish the role of Islam in the substantive regulation of public life, in family life, gender relations, community relations, and in society in general. So this is what distinguishes them sharply, right, from religious nationalists. And for secular nationalists, the critical relevance of Muslim identity is mostly limited to domestic, to a domestic scope. It's not the centerpiece of foreign policy in any way. Whereas for religious nationalists, and here again, we can start with the Democrat Party, its offshoot Justice Party, some other Islamic parties in between, the Welfare Party of the 1990s, and then the AKP today. They made the link between Sunni and national identity more explicit, and I would argue even constricted it in a sense, because they emphasize Sunni identity to a greater degree. Adnan Menderes, the most important political figure of religious nationalism in the 1950s, in a much quoted Konya address in 1956, said the Turkish nation is Muslim and will remain Muslim. Very unequivocal expression, right, of the religious nationalist definition of membership in the nation. And as opposed to the secular nationalists, religious nationalists use state power to expand the influence of religious norms in public life. And for them, Islamic identity has been central to foreign policy. So I should qualify what I just said, though. I mean, they use state power to expand the influence of religious norms to the extent that the political environment allowed, right? Because for the longest time, they operated in an environment where the secularist military and the secularist high judiciary were a counterforce. So they had to be more careful compared to today. Okay, so this is as much as I will say about the clarification of their differences and overlaps. Now I want to focus a little bit on the role of events and how events are inscribed selectively in collective memory and are used to mobilize politically consequential emotions. Genevieve Zubrutsky, who is also one of the editors of our volume, I think she has done more than any scholar to construct an eventful sociology of religion and nationalism. She has pointed, and quite convincingly in my view, to the double significance of symbolically charged events for the relationship between religion and nationalism. Those symbolically charged events not only give expression to dominant idioms of nation and religion that may remain latent or not immediately visible in everyday life or in, let's say, regular kind of periods, but they might also reconfigure that relationship. And I have worked on events myself, on the construction of events, which we tend to consider as social actors, right, as self-evident units of our social experience and historical experience, but are in fact usually constructed, right, by social and political actors with specific kind of invested interests. And that construction involves the bringing together of diverse occurrences, right, in a package, so to speak, right, of the event, labeling it, telling a specific narrative about it, and then inscribing it in, again, collective memory, right, through practices such as curriculum change and textbooks and memorialization, commemorations, erecture of statues, making of documentaries, etc., etc. Right? And I argue here that once an event, a specific interpretation of an event, has been inscribed in collective memory in this way and marked as significant, as transformative and exemplary, then what we have is a kind of emotional path dependence, where through a simple evocation of that event, secular and religious nationalists in this case, or political actors in general, are able to mobilize specific politically consequential emotions. So when I give now examples from Turkish secular and religious nationalism, I hope that this will become a little more clear. I mean, in the paper, I talk about a bunch of such selected events, but here I'll limit myself to two. These are events marked that have been marked by secular nationalists as kind of important, significant, exemplary. The Treaty of Sevr, right, signed in 1920 between the Ottoman Empire, who was on the losing side, obviously, of the Great War, and the Allied powers, that did in fact envision, right, a partition of what remained from the Ottoman territory between Greece and between an independent Armenian state and an autonomous Kurdish state. Yet the point is that its terms were never implemented, right? It was supplanted completely by the Treaty of Lausanne 3 years later, and yet despite basically having been invalidated and never implemented, this became the central political trauma that informed the political course of the Turkish nation state, right? To remind citizens of the ever-present threat of Western powers collaborating with, conspiring with non-Muslim minority populations, and sometimes with Kurds, right, against the territorial integrity of Turkey. So in Müge Göçek's words, this framework of fear and anxiety was then used by political actors to interpret various conflicts throughout the rest of the 20th century. The conflicts with Greece or Cyprus, the Armenian demands for genocide recognition, all of these were approached with this kind of fear and anxiety about the territorial integrity of Turkey. And as Baskın Orhan has discussed extensively, any kind of claims for group rights or kind of cultural recognition have then been perceived as a threat to national unity. So this means that this political trauma of the Treaty of Sevr has helped undermine pluralism and democracy in Turkey. Another event, right, marked as significant and told and retold, and I think this is quite illustrative as well, is the Menemen incident of 1930. This was a local revolt and remained completely local in its scope throughout, right? By some members of a Nakşibendi order. It's actually a pretty interesting story. Under a self-proclaimed Mahdi figure, they demanded Sharia. You know, they were kind of countering, right, the secular republican regime. And when a young teacher and reserve officer defied them, named Kubilay, as those who grew up in Turkey will know from school textbooks, when Kubilay resisted them, he was shot and ultimately beheaded. Right? So this event, the revolt was easily quashed once the government troops arrived. It never expanded anywhere beyond this Aegean town. And yet, secular nationalists have kind of kept reminding, right, through various means, the Turkish citizens of this incident as an object lesson, right, that there was a constant threat, right, of religious reactionaries manipulating the ignorant masses, and which required, therefore, constant vigilance. Right? And Umut Azak has shown that the dramatic imagery of decapitation, right, was used to instill fear in people, right, to support this project for vigilance. So I think, in both cases, a never implemented treaty and an incident, that is real, obviously, but of a very local scale, right, have been selected and have been kind of, revoked to mobilize politically consequential emotions by secular nationalists. Now, Turkish religious nationalists always claimed that secular nationalists have taken these events out of proportion to serve their political ends, and they might be right to some extent, but I would argue that they have done exactly the same, just with a different set of events and with different kinds of, to different kind of socio-political ends. The adoption of the Turkish language as a call to prayer in 1932, kind of under the single-party regime, was a significant source of grievance for religious nationalists. And when Democrat Party came to government in 1950, their very first legislative act was to lift the ban on the recital of the Ezan in Arabic. So this was resolved, right, in 1950. This is 3/4 of the century earlier. Yes, yet this is evoked repeatedly and has been evoked repeatedly, right, by religious nationalists to remind the kind of religious population, the Muslim population, of their victimization at the hands of secular nationalists. Another example is the museumization of Hagia Sophia in 1934, again under the single party, Republican People's Party government. Starting in the 1950s, Hagia Sophia is the 6th century monumental Byzantine church that had been converted to a mosque when the Ottomans conquered Constantinople, and then the early Turkish government turned this, removed its status as a place of worship and made it into a museum. In 1950s, religious nationalist actors started to talk about this event as a betrayal of the nation's Islamic Ottoman heritage, because they argued Hagia Sophia's status as a mosque symbolized Islam's triumph over Christianity. So therefore, turning it into a museum was an ultimate act of religious national betrayal. Necip Fazıl Kısakürek, a quite influential demagogue and poet who was a religious nationalist, said in an oft-quoted speech, "To keep Hagia Sophia closed is a crime equivalent to cursing Allah, spitting on the Quran, throwing Turkish history down the sewer, defiling Turkish chastity, and enslaving the Turkish homeland." I think this is a perfect quote, right? Encapsulating kind of the religious nationalism's sentiments, because it starts with acts of religious sacrilege, spitting on the Quran, cursing Allah, and then talks about acts of national sacrilege, throwing Turkish history down the sewer, and then shows them to be equivalent. So in 2020, and this is where this picture that was also on the poster of the talk comes from, the AKP government finally fulfilled this long yearning of the religious nationalists and reopened Hagia Sophia as a mosque. Sociologist Yağmur Karakaya showed that the government presented this reopening as a grand gesture to remind the people that they have been victimized through the deprivation of their glorious history by the previous regimes. So the message being, of course, that should you vote secular nationalists into power again, you will again be deprived of your glorious history, and you will again be kind of victimized at the hands of secular nationalists. So don't dare to do that. Nagihan Tokdoğan has argued, and she has an excellent book on this, that this sense of victimization and also the sense that the West without, that is Western kind of countries, Europe, as well as the West within, the secular nationalists in the country, had instilled a sense of inferiority, to the religious people who are the authentic people of the Turkish nation, and a sense of victimization was repeatedly reproduced, and this kind of central trope in the AKP discourse defined its main kind of emotional tone as resentment. So resentment was the main emotion mobilized by the AKP throughout its rule. After the consolidation of power, it was combined with a sense of retaliation. Before, it was mostly victimization. Okay. So finally, let's talk a little bit, this is the cultural sociologist in me, let's talk a little bit about political spectacles. Various scholars have argued that politics in the modern world, in the contemporary world, captures the public imagination only to the extent that it offers entertainment value and has emotional appeal. And I would argue also in the case of secular and religious nationalism in Turkey and probably elsewhere too, political spectacles and also fictional popular culture forms played a major role in inculcating the cognitive and emotional structures of secular and religious nationalism, right, in people. And fictional popular culture forms have the advantage here of narrative enchantment and psychological identification, as I will try to show in a little bit. So let's start with the political spectacles. You know, for secular nationalists, the main political spectacles that they stage for the longest time have been the official celebrations of national holidays. These were highly choreographed events, rather formally in tone, often involved kind of military parades. So the students, it was mandatory for students to attend these and also sometimes to perform in unison, right, in these events. I mean, I remember being recruited for one of those in high school. So in the 1990s, though, this became a problem for secular nationalists because not only Islamists but also political liberals criticized these commemorations or ceremonies for failing to generating popular excitement or popular engagement, and also saw them as symptomatic, or argued that they were symptomatic of secular nationalism's top-down nature, right? That secular nationalism was a state imposition on the people, right? In response, secular nationalists had to develop a new strategy, which is sometimes referred to as neo-Kemalism by some scholars. So, and that strategy involved the staging of displays of voluntary, spontaneous adherence to secular nationalism, right? Which is ironic because the state was very much involved in staging these kind of spectacles or these displays. And Zencirci calls this an effort to transform the emotional appeal of secularism. What they did was delegating the organization of the celebrations, of the ceremonies to non-governmental organizations, so they would be treated in civil society and not in the state. The celebrations started to kind of stage pop stars singing songs, and therefore kind of bringing people in. The picture is Kenan Doğulu, still a quite influential pop singer in Turkey, and his pop rendition of the 10th anniversary march, right, written originally for to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the Republic, is still played very much at these events. And I would argue, though, that secular nationalists' efforts to do that was met, in fact, halfway by many citizens who started to wear Atatürk pins, lapel pins on their clothing. This is especially the case in the late 1990s in the context of the ascendance of political Islam in Turkey. Many of these secular citizens placed pictures of Atatürk in their private spaces, in their homes, in their workplaces, and these pictures tended to depict Atatürk not as was the kind of conventional way in his military attire or in his formal suit as a statesman, but in everyday activities as a private person, playing with children, right, traveling on a train, etc. Yael Navarro and Esra Özürek have written extensively about this phenomenon. So what about the spectacles thrown by religious nationalists? Here again, I have a couple of examples in the paper, but I'll just talk about one. The commemorations of the conquest of Istanbul, and this ties neatly into the debates about Hagia Sophia. They started under the welfare party, Islamic welfare party municipal governments in the late 1990s, but were taken to a completely new level of sophistication under and scope under the AKP governments. So Yağmur Karakaya, the Yale sociologist that I briefly mentioned earlier, she has in fact done an ethnography of one of these commemorations where she shows that advanced audiovisual technologies were used to create emotional effect. Not only kind of the Janissary marching bands playing kind of moving music and religious nationalist poems read by well-known television series actors in costume on the stage, but also air displays by fighter jets and 3D laser light show that a lot of people were impressed by this, that she interviewed, that depicts the story of the conquest of Istanbul by Mehmet II. So these sorts of technologies of the senses, right? The air display by fighter jets, right? They do create a sense of emotional heightening, right? Because of the smoke and the sound, right? Just the sensation. And then came in Erdogan and gave a speech which linked this emotional effervescence to his religious national messaging. Just one sentence out of that speech: the conquest is about a 21-year-old sultan bringing the West to its knees. Again, a very nice statement, reflecting the religious nationalist kind of sentiments. And this is finally, what about fictional popular culture? I briefly talked about this, or I will briefly talk about this. These are two shows that were produced, that were sponsored by the state, basically, produced by the public broadcaster TRT. The first one is Resurrection Ertuğrul. This is about the founding myth of the Ottoman Empire. Ertuğrul is the father of Osman, known as the first Ottoman Sultan. And very little is known about him, which gives lots of room for freedom, I think, to those who write the scripts here. The second one, Payitaht Abdülhamit, is about the reign of Abdülhamit II, a very important figure for religious nationalists. And these shows, kind of through compelling plots and compelling characters, reproduce some quintessential religious nationalist tropes, such as Christian and Jewish powers conspiring with treasonous domestic elites to undermine Muslim Turkish polities. And they include many obvious parallels. It would be very hard to miss kind of parallels with contemporary political actors and events, although they are historical dramas. In fact, audience reception research on these shows demonstrates that viewers commonly see the protagonists as fictional reincarnations of Erdogan. They really say things like Ertuğrul is Erdogan, or Abdülhamit is just like Erdogan. And in fact, Erdogan himself, refers to both of these shows once occasionally. And before the crucial referendum that ended up leading to the transition of an authoritarian presidential regime in 2017, in one of his speeches, Erdogan referred to Payitaht Abdülhamit and said the same schemes are carried out today in the exact same manner. What the West does to us is the same, just the era and actors are different. Okay, so just by way of a very brief conclusion, how can we move, how can the Turkish society move, right, beyond this impasse between secular and religious nationalism? Again, this going back and forth between the two has not been helpful to constructing a more democratic and pluralist society. I just want to briefly point to two developments. One of them is the fact, not, I think, appreciated to the extent that it should be, I'm not saying necessarily celebrated, but this is, I think, an important shift, is that secular nationalists in Turkey have largely given up the militant form of laicite which they advocated in the late 1990s, during the period known as the February 28 process. That form of laicite had sought to suppress public manifestations of Islam. Think about the headscarf controversy, for example, and with the support of the military, which I think discredited also secular nationalists to a great degree, I think, in the public. So they are no longer doing that. And it seems that they have given up kind of a naive secularist expectation that should there be a proper process of modernization in Turkey, then religion will simply cease to be relevant or will wither away. And more concretely, in more concrete terms, the main political representative of secular nationalism, the Republican People's Party, since 2014, endorsed a religious conservative candidate for president, Ekmelettin İhsanoğlu, here in the picture, nominated various politicians with Islamic credentials, and some of them have become RPP deputies, and although politically completely, I think, misleading, not a very good move, they did form an electoral pact with 3 Islamic parties, right, in the elections of 2023. So this is kind of new, right? And I don't think this in itself amounts to kind of a democratic turn in secular nationalism necessarily, but I think where it's important is that the militant form of laicite fueled this kind of mutual escalation between secular and religious nationalists, right? Because they mobilize in relationship to each other, and so this is an element that might contribute to de-escalation in a certain way. And on the religion side, I mean, what I would call civil Islam occupies still a relatively small place within the Islamic bloc in Turkey, but nevertheless, it is becoming more prominent, it is diversifying, and it is growing. And here I'm referring to kind of organizations or initiatives such as Democratic Islam Congress, organized by the Kurdish movement, Labor and Justice Platform. They are critical of capitalism and also the Muslim capitalist class, Muslim feminist collectives such as Havle and others. What unites these kinds of currents of what I call civil Islam is that, first of all, they come up with progressive interpretations of Islamic sources that diverge sharply from conservative interpretations. They are extremely critical of the instrumentalization of Islam in the service of political power and economic interests, and they explicitly seek to decouple Islam from its entanglement with Turkish nationalism. And many of these actors have shown themselves as open to collaboration with secular progressive activists in movements for social justice, movements for women's rights, and advocacy for democratization. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ateş, for such a really illuminating and rich talk. You covered a lot of ground. I'm sure our audience members have questions for you. So let's take some questions. If you could also tell us who you are.
I'm Zeynep Ertuğrul. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at Columbia University, Sakip Center for Turkish Studies. Thank you really for this talk, because I think it's really rare that in the scholarship on secularism and Islamism, or secular nationalism and religious nationalism in Turkey, I think many scholars exclude the treatment of non-Muslims from their analysis, as if the history of secularism in Turkey has no relationship to genocide or non-Muslim communities in the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic. So it's really refreshing to hear that. And I think also it's a layer of denial concerning genocide and discrimination against non-Muslims in Turkey. I was wondering, my question is about the role of non-Sunni Muslims. What is the place of Alevism in this secular nationalism or religious nationalism you talked about? And again, linked to this question, what is the place of events such as the Sheikh Said rebellion regarding this list of symbolically charged events? And the last question is, what is common to secular and religious nationalisms in your analysis? So you were talking about everything, like how to distinguish them from each other, and what is their common ground?
Okay, if I start with the last question, I think what is common is the marking of group membership through Muslimness. I mean, this is common to both. So this is a thin sense of religion, right? Religion as identity. This goes back to, I think, Frederick Barth and his well-known work on ethnic boundaries. So the boundary is what's important, right? The content doesn't matter that much. I mean, although this perspective has come under criticism, I think there's an important point to make there, right? Because for secular nationalists, Muslimness definitely matters in this way. There is also, though, the work of Barış Ünlü, which I talk about in the paper and didn't have time to talk about today, where he comes up with this idea, interesting idea of kind of an overlaying of a Muslimness contract and a Turkishness contract that comes after. And he's able to account through that. I mean, the contracts are tacit contracts. He draws from the notion of the racial contract from whiteness studies. But I think he's able to get at the fact that Kurds are being left out of the circle of security and privilege with the shift to the Republic. So I think that's he does a very good job of kind of analyzing that. But I think again, Muslimness as a marker of membership in the nation is coming to all, definitely, and that explains why both secular nationalist and religious nationalist forms of government in Turkey led to these list of grim events, right, for non-Muslims. In terms of Alevism, that's a great question. I mean, Alevis have traditionally, as we know, allied with the secularists, and it's actually a quite typical case, I mean, in comparative perspective, right? When you fear domination by the religious majority, as a religious minority, you might support secularism, right? And I think that has been also the case for Alevis in Turkey. But I mean, not only do they support, of course, the Republican People's Party, but they also constitute it, right, to some extent. I mean, this is a very good question that probably I should have thought about this further and integrated it into this analysis because it's kind of a review. But I mean, for politically speaking, for most of the time, they align themselves with secular nationalists. And I don't think they emerge necessarily as a critical voice against the treatment of non-Muslims. Maybe there are some exceptions, but I think in the overall trajectory, I don't think they have served as a force of that kind. And what was the third point? Sorry. I forgot the question in between.
About the Sheikh Said rebellion.
Oh yes, that's one of the events that I do cover in the paper.
Okay.
I had 4 events marked by secular nationalists, exemplary events. One of them is the incident of March 31st that happened under the QUP governance. This is the first time that the trope of reactionary forces kind of emerges, which then characterizes like secular nationalist critiques or fears of religious nationalism for the rest of the republic. And the Sheikh Said rebellion is definitely one of those events. Yes, definitely. Treated in the paper, but not in the presentation.
Let's take another question. Yes, please, if you could tell us who you are.
My name is Nadia Christie. I'm a postdoc at the Center for the Study of Social Difference at Columbia. I have 2 questions. One is, you mentioned really briefly this question of foreign policy. I'm curious to understand maybe some of the distinctions between your 2 sides on the question of foreign policy and the role of Turkey within the Middle East. Because it seems like, for example, that there's a quote about it being as a kind of counter to the West somehow, as counter Western imperialism at certain points in its history. So I'm curious to understand how Turkey's role within the region is seen by the secular nationalists and the religious nationalists, whether today or in the past. And then my second question was, it seems like part of the problematic that you're thinking through is the role of like non-Muslim, like this lack of a pluralistic, democratic kind of approach to politics, right? And the non-Muslim within that. And it feels like at the end when you talk about how to move beyond, it's like they're moving towards each other a little bit. But I'm curious to know about like the non-Muslim still, it seems, and what's happened to that figure in this kind of move towards. And is that like somehow, is there moving beyond in that? I don't know. Yeah, well.
I mean, in terms of foreign policy, you're right. I mean, because the secular nationalism's kind of course in foreign policy has changed significantly, right, throughout the trajectory of the republic up until the present. I mean, obviously, its initial orientation was, although secular nationalists also adopted some kind of anti-imperialist rhetoric, they were very much, for Turkey facing the West, right, and entering Western sorts of alliances, and then that changed somehow, right? For example, I remember that during the first term, definitely, if not the first 2 terms, and Turkey would know this much better. That suddenly we had this interesting case where secular nationalists were mostly opposing Turkey's membership in the EU, right? The military the kind of secular nationalist establishment. And the AKP was pro-EU, right? Pro-EU accession. Whether genuinely or whether instrumentally, because that would reduce the role of the military in the polity, right? I leave that question aside, but that really was the case. That is a little confusing, right, in that sense. So secular nationalists have turned over time against the West, and yet even then, when they sought other sorts of alliances, I don't think it has been necessarily with the Muslim world. I mean, they had the Turkic region kind of, like that after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, they wanted to build this kind of regional basis of power with the other Turkic republics. And then sometimes we see secular nationalists now flirting, some parts of secular nationalism flirting with like a Russian alliance, etc. But I think Muslim identity has not been central to that throughout. But the attitude towards the West has changed quite a bit, you're right. In terms of religious nationalism, I mean, there is also a change there, because throughout the 1950s and 60s, religious nationalists were very much on the Cold War bandwagon, right? That alliance with the US, because that also worked well together with their project to strengthen Islam in Turkey, as we know that the Cold War policy of the US was to strengthen Islam in the region as an antidote against communism. So they also, have become very pro-West, pro-US, right, for a long time. But what we see today is very interesting, because the AKP, by kind of adopting this a Muslim identity in foreign politics since probably Davos in 2009, they have built a huge global communication apparatus, right? And Erdogan's books are being published in English, and they have adopted this discourse of representing the Muslim world against Western hegemons, even the other oppressed peoples of the world, right? I mean, knowing Turkish politics and the AKP's position vis-a-vis oppressed groups, of course, this appears extremely kind of ironic to us. But nevertheless, there is this discourse being supported by an entire communication apparatus, TRT world, TRT channels in various world languages. The Anadolu agency is now operating in English. Cronies have been encouraged or made to publish English newspapers, and there are think tanks. And there's this discourse, right? Erdogan is the kind of leader of resistance against Western hegemons for the oppressed peoples, and especially for Muslims. So that's really kind of an interesting development, I think. And Bilge Yeşil has just published an excellent book about this.
Let's take another question. Yes.
My name is Talha İşsevenler. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of sociology at Can J and City College. And actually Professor Ateş Altinordu was my professor at Sabanci about
A while ago,
15 years ago maybe. So it's
when I first started,
touching. And actually I took a class with you on political sociology, so that was my last class. So this is really sweet for me to be here. You answered, or you touched upon international political economy in your response, but in the genealogy you developed for us today, the unit of analysis is basically the nation state, and it was a history self-contained in the nation state, which I was always wondering how methodologically that's what are the challenges, methodological challenges to that? As you mentioned, that adoption of Islamic identity in post-1980s happens in a resonance with U.S. foreign policy and neoliberalism, and even secular nationalists admit that it was a way of opening to the Middle Eastern markets. Turkey couldn't have made money, basically, keeping its secularist kind of umbrella. So I wonder, how do you tackle that methodologically, like entanglements of international politics with national reconfiguration of identity? Because, as you mentioned again in your answer, the secular nationalists were adopting this modernist ideology of some sort of positivism as a way to modernization, that religion was an obstacle to technology development. So the idea was that the nation's resources would be best used if it adopts an anti-religious kind of culture, which would include women. So I wonder, like, where does political economy theoretically sit in to your analysis? Whether it falls or it prioritizes an identity, and how does cultural sociology in general deal with political economy? Where do you see like work is being done or not really done quite extensively?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, the transnational dimension, I mean, whether it's political economy or other sorts of factors, is definitely very influential. You're right. I mean, I don't really have a methodology in this because it's not like an empirical study. It's a critical review or thought piece. So I just gather different strands here and there. But you're right. Maybe I should have given more attention to kind of the international context. I mean, that's a good question, or that's a good comment, actually. Yes, that in the relationship between secular and religious nationalists, probably this kind of transnational political economy is a very important factor, and I should think more about it.
Good questions. Take one or two more.
My name is Aziz Mubin. I am from GSAS Graduate School of Art and Sciences, Global Art Department.
Can you speak up, please? Can you speak up?
Yeah, my name is Aziz Mubin. I'm from GSAS Graduate School of Art and Sciences, Global Art Department. I have an undergrad with philosophy. So I'm going to frame my question as much philosophical as I can. In my opinion, all of the heritage of philosophy, philosophers have produced a lot of different ideas, political side, or individualistic side, or sociological side, etc., economical side. So I think one of the moral ideas in human history has to be reduced secular in terms of political side as a philosophical idea. So I want to hear your opinion about secular in philosophical view and in theory, and what is the most practical secularism a try for a human being, whether it's a government, especially a government like France or like we see now Turkey and other countries, who is the more toward the secular in terms of philosophical theory, because we see a lot of differences and a lot of intricacies in its concept, itself. So I want to hear your opinion, practical versus theory and the human try in last few sentences.
I'm seeing a lot of strange faces, so would it help if I repeat what I understand?
Yes,
The
yes.
question is, I think it's a question about
yeah.
what is your understanding of secularism as a philosophical concept, and where do you see between different models of secularism that we see, where do you see the practice coming closest to that sort of theoretical understanding? Is that my understanding?
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Well, that's a huge question, right? But you're right. I mean, I also work on secularism, and there is not a thing like you also pointed out, I think somewhere in your commentary, that there is no single form of secularism, that we see various instantiations. India, Turkey, right? U.S., France. I mean, as a sociologist, I have to say I'm not a normative theorist, so I just try to explain those differences rather than kind of come up with a normative ideal. But I mean, I think generally the militant form of laicite that was characteristic, for example, of the earlier phases of secular nationalism, that's definitely not a preferable form for various normative ends, right? And it's also bound to produce backlash, right? I mean, I really think that the headscarf, for example, the headscarf controversy, we might be a little tired of talking about it now because it has been overstudied, But I think it was crucial in to the rise of political Islam in Turkey, for example. So that could have been avoided in a way, right? So it's and also normatively speaking, I think it was extremely problematic. On the other hand, secularism does have a value, obviously, as we see now, right? Also in Turkey, where it's under assault. Rajiv Bhargava has come up with a solution that is maybe a way out, a easy way out. But he said, we need to have a contextual understanding of secularism, or contextual ideals of secularism that is context specific, because it depends, right? Are you talking about what kind of secularism to enact in the US or in a place like Turkey, right? For example, where you do have kind of a long tradition of politicized religion, politicized majority religion, perhaps some of the safeguards are more crucial, right? Because you do have this threat of majoritarian hegemony, right? Whereas in other contexts where you have some immigrant religiosity, right? Maybe you can have different sorts of considerations in finding the perfect or the ideal model of secularism. So I think I agree with him, although I kind of joked about it being a kind of easy way out. I agree with him that it's very difficult to come up with a single notion of ideal perfect secularism that could be applied in all settings. I think the political context and the historical context matters a great deal, as well as the religious composition of the population.
We're officially at time, but maybe we can squeeze in one more brief question if there is one, and a brief answer. Yes.
Can I ask something very briefly?
Please.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the talk. My question is about, I missed the first 3-4 minutes, I guess, of the talk, so if you mentioned about it. But Ayasofya question, zincirler kırılsın, Ayasofya açılsın, whatever. But it didn't really create that kind of a big euphoric, moment in the society that I would expect. It was correct me if I'm wrong, it was like the COVID year,
Yes.
people were doing
Yes.
it. So
it was
they
2020.
did this, there was a small backlash from the West, something bigger from the Greece, but within Istanbul, I didn't see kind of a big, finally it came, maybe Erdogan used it too early. What do you think? Maybe it was like just bullets missed or used too early? I don't know.
Yeah, you're right. The thing is, he wanted to use it, I think, in 2017 when he needed it, before the local elections, I assume, right? And he didn't win those elections. So you're right. He saved this card for a long time because it was also, he knew that it would cause a lot of kind of controversy internationally as well. So he knew this long ink. He kept this card. He didn't think it was worth pursuing, right? And then he used it when he thought he needed it, and it didn't give him many returns. You're right. And then when the opening itself happened finally in 2020, you are completely right. It was a huge opening, right? Which in the middle of the pandemic, we hardly saw such public kind of gatherings, but that of course the government was behind it, so it was allowed. You're right. It wasn't this huge euphoria one might have expected from all these decades of delayed wish fulfillment. At the same time, what the AKP does is, and here I'm also drawing on Yağmur Karakaya's work on this, is that they keep kind of bringing this up, especially in the kind of anniversaries of its reopening, and they have basically videos about this, and they have billboards about this, and that kind of keeps emphasizing the theme, according to Karakaya's analysis, of that this was a gift, this was this grand gesture by the AKP to the people, and again reminding them of their past victimization. So it's being used to reproduce that very central discourse that the AKP has going. But it hasn't, you're right, it's a grand gesture, but it hasn't created the explosive effect that they wanted. You're right, he probably miscalculated
I suggest that maybe, it might be an example of the sort of diminishing marginal utility of appeals to faith after, over 2 decades of kind of incumbency, perhaps. You and I, in a, conversation before this talk, were, discussing whether there's a sort of tiring, general
Fatigue.
sense of fatigue. Exactly, with the narratives of sort of, the underdog and the religious kind of discourse being finally restored to its rightful place in Turkish politics. What would you say to that?
I think you're right. I mean, first of all, it's very difficult for the AKP to to continue with the populist discourse that they are the underdog. I mean, they are projecting this. I think one of the reasons they are projecting this to the international stage, we defend kind of the oppressed people of the world, is because it's very difficult for the AKP to argue that they are the underdogs at this point after having been the establishment for so long, and it's a problem for utilizing populist discourse. So they are using it to kind of keep alive the memory of victimization, but you're right, that's a very hard feat, and it's less and less credible. And yes, this fatigue about religion is definitely, I think, the case. We see many manifestations of it, as we discussed the other day. That's a lot of, there is this, I mean, for those of you who haven't followed kind of discussions in Turkey over the last few years, there is this debate or controversy about deism in Turkey, a term like that usually we talk about in history courses, right? That in American founders or something, or deists or something. But this refers to those group of people many of them coming from conservative families, many of them attending religious schools, imamative schools, that, I mean, in their eyes, religion's ethical, Islam's ethical kind of credentials have been kind of tarnished, through its instrumentalization, right, in political power by the AKP. But they don't want to go all the way to say that they are atheists. So they say we are deists, meaning that we are no longer attached to organized Islam, but we still believe in God, for example. So yes, I mean, I think that is definitely a phenomenon that might also partly explain. I never thought about it, but why the Hagia Sophia reopening did not create the explosive effect that probably the AKP expected from it. Right.
Please join me in thanking Professor Altinordu.